Now, imagine yourselves for a minute in the presence of George Washington in the spring of 1789. The man before you was 57 years old. That doesn't sound like much. By the standards of its day, Washington would have been almost 80 years old. This was an old man who was being asked to shoulder the burdens of the presidency. Of noble carriage and regal gravitas, at 6 feet 3 inches tall, he towered over most of his contemporaries by at least half a foot. Washington's 200 pounds were evenly distributed over a bony, muscular frame hardened by a lifetime of outdoor exercise and physical adversity. At the height of his fame, Washington is no longer at the peak of his form. The chestnut hair of his youth was turning white. Washington was a redhead in his early days, as was Alexander Hamilton, as was Thomas Jefferson, as was the Marquis de Lafayette. So remember, if nothing else from this lecture, that you owe your liberties to redheads. His low, and also he never wore a wig. There's another, if you can impress your friends. His low, rather indistinct voice made him anything but a great communicator. In fact, he was painfully awkward when delivering a speech. His memory was failing, or so he claimed. His hearing was unreliable. Most of all, he dreaded the presidency's inevitable toll on his popularity and reputation. He likened his situation to that of a culprit bound to his place of execution. "I fear I must bid adieu to happiness," Washington blurted out to a friend only days before his first inaugural, "for I see nothing but clouds and darkness before me, and I call God to witness that the day which shall carry me again into public life will be a more distressing one than any I have ever yet known." Then he fired off to Hamilton and John Jay a list of painfully earnest inquiries, the first attempt to define a working presidency. Would it be appropriate, he asked, for the executive to make himself available to members of the public every morning at 8 o'clock? What about hosting regular small dinners for, quote, distinguished characters, or large-scale public entertainments on the 4th of July and other national holidays, presidential tours when Congress was in recess? Meanwhile, said lawmakers were furiously debating what the new head of government should be called. Members of the Senate favored the higher tone, His Highness, the President of the United States and protector of their liberties. The new Vice President, John Adams, was appalled when the House of Representatives, the so-called People's House, urged that Washington be addressed simply as the President of the United States. "What would the common people of other countries think of such a title?" said Adams. "They will despise him to all eternity." John Adams had many gifts, but he was not a prophet. For his part, Washington had other more pressing concerns. Chronically short of cash, the president-elect was forced to borrow money from a friend to cover travel expenses to his inaugural in New York in April 1789. 10,000 people stood outside Federal Hall to see him take the oath of office. "I have no lust for power," Washington insisted. This did not mean that he had no taste for politics. Indeed, no small part of Washington's genius as a politician was his ability to convince everyone, beginning with himself, that he was no politician at all. Quote, "In politics as in religion, my tenets are few and simple," he wrote, "the leading one of which is to be honest and just ourselves, and to exact it from others, meddling as little as possible in their affairs where our own are not involved." The platform might be a simple one, but George Washington was anything but a simple man. In many ways, his vision of the American Republic was an extension of his own character. Because he credited harsh self-discipline in realizing his personal destiny, he embraced an energetic government as the only means of protecting the American Union from flying apart. Because he balanced executive vigor with personal restraint, he gave us a government strong enough to lead and wise enough to listen. In a nation that as yet existed on paper only, his friend Henry Knox spoke the truth when he said that it was Washington's character and not the freshly signed Constitution that held the raw republic together. Think about that. The Constitution was a scrap of parchment that never would have been ratified, except people were absolutely convinced that George Washington would be the first president, and only would they entrust to Washington this radical document, convinced that, after all, he had turned down the chance to be a king once. They trusted Washington with power. A revolutionary on the battlefield, in office, Washington was a cautious man with much to be cautious about. There's a wonderful scene. He was a literalist. He took very literally the words of this document. And remember, it talks about the president seeking the advice and consent of the Senate for treaties and nominations. So what does he do? On August 22nd, 1789, the president goes down to Federal Hall. He goes to the Senate, and he personally delivers a proposed treaty with Southern Indian tribes for legislative approval. Well, of course, naively, he thinks that the Senate is going to act on it on the spot. Then as now, lawmakers were jealous of their prerogatives. Realizing that no immediate decision would be forthcoming, Washington briefly lost his temper. He had a hell of a temper. His secretary, his presidential secretary, Tobias Lear, said no sound on earth compared with that of George Washington swearing a blue streak. But he'd spent a lifetime controlling his temper. Quickly, he regained his composure. The embarrassed president gracefully withdrew from the legislative halls. In private, however, Washington nursed his grievance against the dilatory senators, insisting that he would be, in his words, damned, rather than face such public humiliation a second time. He proved a man of his word, never went back, and neither has any of his successors. That one totally unscripted action defined the relationship between the president and the Senate. In fact, every action Washington took set a precedent to guide or limit his successors. Another reason for caution. It was Washington who designated a site for the new nation's permanent capital, while spurning the suggestion of one congressman from South Carolina who wanted the federal city to be named Washingtonopolis. Kind of trips off the tongue, doesn't it? Sensitive as a tuning fork, Washington regularly inquired into what others said and thought of him. His uneasiness grew in the first year of his presidency, thanks to whispered complaints about the allegedly royalist trappings of the executive household. Now, remember, we had just gotten rid of a king, and there were a lot of Americans who worried that the Constitution created too strong a government, and they had an eagle eye on the president. Even though it was Washington, they wanted to make absolutely certain that the royalist trappings of George III didn't poison, the new nation. Now, talk about unroyalist. Every Tuesday afternoon, you could walk into George Washington's house on Broadway in New York at 2 o'clock. As long as you were decently attired, you could walk in to a reception. And these were sort of less than spontaneous, but nevertheless, Washington would walk into the room in a suit of native broadcloth, his hair powdered, and a hair bag, and everyone would form a circle, and Washington would walk around, and he didn't shake hands. That was overly democratic. The first president to shake hands was Thomas Jefferson, who famously used to greet visitors at the front door of the White House himself, sometimes in his bathroom slippers and robe. Very democratic. But the fact is, Washington was walking this fine tightrope. He wanted to be accessible, but he didn't want to be too accessible. One of the interesting, odd debates that took place is, should a president of the United States attend dinner parties, private dinner parties? Should a president of the United States attend funerals? It was finally decided yes and no. Every Thursday afternoon, he had a dinner, in effect a state dinner, for members of Congress and others on a rotating basis. God, can you imagine keeping George Washington waiting? He was a very punctual man. And he had a wonderful line. Any hostess here is welcome to use it. He waited 5 minutes for tardy guests to arrive before he entered the dining room. "Sir," he told latecomers, "we are too punctual for you. I have a cook who never asks whether the company has come, but whether the hour has come." At that point, no doubt you would slink into the dining room, put in your place, probably not open your mouth for the rest of the dinner. One of Washington's dinner guests recounted he is generally sedate and serious, and only after having had 2 or 3 glasses of wine, and when roused by the conversation around him, does his face assume an expression of liveliness. With sufficient champagne, it was added, the president became positively merry. He also had the same toast. He always, at the end of dinner, he would raise his glass and toast to all our friends.